Thank you all for coming after a hopefully good lunch. I had the lunch here in the hotel, and it was actually not bad. So I hope yours was good too. I hope you don't go into a food coma. I'm going to try to keep it entertaining at least a little bit. So yeah, let's do this. We're going to be talking about Pinterest's new mobile web. For those who are not familiar, we just released a brand new progressive web app. We did a hard fork of our original site. So it was a completely brand new code base, and we're going to talk about kind of how we got to the point where we decided to do that, and how we did it, and then the results of how that worked. So, quick introduction. My name is Zack Argyle. I've been at Pinterest for over 3 years now. I've got a whole crew here with me. This front row, the 5 on this side are all from Pinterest. We've got a really great culture there. Before that, I was at PlayStation for a while, which is also here in the city, and then at a small startup in Utah called VeriSage. I've got a couple things that I've done through open source. The biggest one was we open sourced our service worker libraries that we use at Pinterest. And if you have any questions about those, feel free to ask me. All right, so I kind of mentioned what we're going to talk about. The first is the story of how we got there, and then how we did it and the results. I'm going to show like real metrics for what happened. So if any of you are interested in kind of going through the same process, I hope that you can use the information that I share to be able to convince people that it's worthwhile. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. It was a dark night. At the beginning of 2015, the Pinterest mobile web experience had been neglected and left to fester in the dirty recesses of Brannan Street. This is so bad. It's so bad it's good. We came to a fork in the road. Do we, on one hand, improve the mobile web experience, or do we encourage people to use the native apps instead? Which, through our investigation, showed that the native apps had a lot higher levels of engagement. We were a small team at the time and decided that we didn't have the resources to revamp the mobile web experience, so we did 2 things. I skipped those. We did 2 things. First, we introduced a full-page app upsell, an interstitial. This pattern has been copied by a lot of companies, to my dismay. And I actually feel bad for that because we're a big reason why people do this. And it is not a great experience. Like if you've tried using Pinterest or Yelp or something like that, and they just say you have to download the app if you want to do anything. That's a big reason for that is us, and I do apologize. We're hoping to make it better. The second thing that we introduced was what we call automatic deep linking. So if you were not logged in and you clicked on anything in the site, we automatically deep linked you to the native app. Now that's great if you have the native app, but if you don't, you go to the App Store. So you want to go see some cute picture of a cat, and we send you to the App Store. And the best part is, if you then sign up, you don't even get to see the cat. So there were definitely some issues with this approach. But we did see lifts in engagement overall, which is why we did it. So there I stood, back in 2015, on a dark road, displeased yet content with the decision we'd made. I still think it was the right thing at the time for the size of our company. But yet I could not shake the feeling that someday we would revisit the decision. That someday things would change. And sometimes I felt like I was the only one there that cared. The only one who saw that it was a bad user experience. You all laugh because it's like kind of obvious, but at the same time, like when metrics are telling you that something is improving, it's hard to think that like maybe it's not actually a bad user experience. Turns out I was not alone. There were others who agreed with me. You can't read those. Pinterest mobile web experience is a nightmare. Your mobile web experience is bull. Beep. Fix that. Oh, and there's more. Pinterest is the portal to the worst of mobile web UX. It's an evil curse on the mobile web. There's more. Pinterest on mobile web is so beeping annoying. Wow, Pinterest is such a dick on mobile web. They all gave me permission to share these, actually. I thought it was kind of funny. They were all very nice. And there's more. Pinterest is the absolute worst. Beep. I don't want to have to download a beep beep app just to look at pictures of cupcakes. And this one might be my favorite. This is the last one. You have the stupidest mobile web version. It's non-existent. I don't want to download your super fast, stupid app, Pinterest. Suck it. Thank you, Ahmed. We get it. This is how I felt after seeing these. And I learned a very, very important lesson. And that is that metrics do not measure sentiment. That's something that a lot of us don't think about. We look at the metrics and say, oh, hey, it's lifting some arbitrary number that we're caring about, but we don't think about the sentiment cost of people that we don't see. Right? So for example, if I have this, like for us, we had this bad experience coming from SEO. Right? You click on like a Pinterest link. I'm sure a lot of you have clicked on a link on like Google search results and gone to Pinterest, and then you like don't even get to see the thing that you clicked on that you wanted to see, or maybe like image search, right? And then what we're doing is we're training people to not even click on that link the next time. The next time they see a link in search results and they see that it's from Pinterest, they don't want to click on it. And your metrics do not measure that. You don't know what you're missing, right? You don't know what you're teaching people. So I do have some exciting news. Things have changed. We started working on the new mobile web project back in beginning of July, and in September we shipped our brand new experience to all authenticated users. You heard me right, that is a 3-month rewrite, and it was about 40 pages and maybe 30 or 40,000 lines of code. Some of the people here worked on that, and it was fantastic. And for those who are not logged in, we are still working on it. There are SEO implications, especially because Google is moving towards a mobile-first index. But I can say that we have shipped to almost the whole world for those coming from our AMP pages. If you click on something on an AMP page, you are going to get the new version of Pinterest, even when you are logged out. And the experience is a lot more open than it was previously. So you will see the content you want. You can go scroll around, see related pins, and it is so much better. So outside of sentiment, what are the reasons for why we would want to invest in the mobile web? There are other reasons. A lot of them kind of have to do with our international users. In the US, we have a tendency to look at US culture and think that and project it onto the entire world. But the fact is that's not true. In a lot of countries in the world, they just don't download apps. They don't want to download apps. They don't have the memory to download apps. They don't have the bandwidth to download apps. And if you want to expand globally, you need to give them an option. Secondly, and it kind of ties in with that one, is there are a lot of people who are really, I mean, they're not like the core users, right? And there's these people like maybe they're coming from SEO, maybe they're coming from some social link that was shared. These are your low engaged users, and when you're blocking them off, you're losing out on the opportunity to convert them to more core users by showing them what they could have. And the last is having a better landing experience, and that's kind of tied in with the rest. So a question that I hear a lot is, should I make my site responsive or should I make a separate mobile website? This is a huge question, and if you go back maybe 5 years, there was a huge push for full responsive design sites, right? Like every site should work perfectly well on desktop and mobile. But in my opinion, if you have more than 20 web engineers in your company, you should have a dedicated mobile web, period. And there's reasons for that. Some of the reasons that I can think of are that, and this is something I've seen a lot, is when people are building things for the web, especially when you have a lot of engineers building these features, they don't test everything, right? They're testing on their nice MacBook Pros on their desktops, and they don't test on some crappy mobile device, and they can't see what those error states will be if things kind of go poorly, or even how it scales down correctly. And so that's a huge benefit. Like we now at Pinterest, we don't have to worry about anybody doing anything on desktop that's going to affect mobile web, and that's a huge blessing if you have the engineers to support it. So again, that's why I give my advice, if you've got more than 20 web engineers, then you can probably support it because it's important. Secondly, when you have all of this information combined together in the same code base, there's like no matter what you do, there is going to be places where you say, if is mobile, do this. If is desktop, do this. And it makes it very, very difficult to know what is actually being rendered where, and it escalates very, very quickly. So the benefit of having them fully separated is you can actually have less logical complexity. You have another surface for experimentation. Say you want to experiment for something that you think would benefit specifically your international users who are on like low bandwidth devices. Like now you have a very simple way to target just them, and you don't have to add extra code to your desktop code base. There's another one that I didn't add on there. Like your desktop code base can be bigger now. There's a huge push for like very, very small apps. But on desktop, like that doesn't really matter. People usually have really, really good internet connection, and you can push down, 600 or 700 kilobytes of JavaScript, and it's not a big deal. But on mobile web, the idea is you want to shoot for around 150 to 200 kilobytes, and so having those split out, you can kind of weigh the benefits because there are definitely performance benefits after the initial load for having everything loaded up front. So you can do that on desktop. And lastly, you can optimize specifically for the touch surfaces, which I think is important. All right, so I mean, it took me 2 years. It took me months of working on we have like some time that you can use dedicated for side projects. And I used that for working on mobile web. And then eventually a hackathon project showing the actual true power that we have now to create a good mobile web experience before we actually got the sign-off to do this project, and specifically to do the fork. So it took a lot of work, and I hope like you guys can take this back and show people and say like, hey, this is worthwhile. I shouldn't have to go through this whole thing to make this happen. You can show some of our results. But we got to this point where we had a blank slate. And there's some things that I think are really important when you have a blank slate, when you're starting from scratch, specifically when you know what the end state should look like as well. Right, when you're starting from scratch for like some brand new startup and you don't really know how it's going to grow. For us, we knew there was already going to be 40 or 50 pages. There was going to be 40, 50 routes. There was going to be all kinds of different logging implementations that we had to support, and like a ton of different things. So we knew what the end was supposed to be. And when you have that, there's something I think that is really, really important that you have to ask yourself, and that is, what can we enforce from the start? And for me, that is, you enforce consistency, and that's kind of like how I write something, how I build something. It should be consistent. It should have enforced performance and enforced accessibility. And I think those are really, really key, especially if you're building from scratch and you know kind of what the end goal is. If it's something that's a lot smaller than our code base was going to be, like maybe you don't have to worry about it quite as much, but I still think it's really, really important. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that we enforced some of these things at Pinterest that I think have been really helpful. The first is consistency, and we have a component library, and that's been talked about a lot. Sarah gave a great talk earlier today about their style guides and design languages, and ours is built into our component library. It's built with React, and it is an easy way to enforce consistent styles. So we've got a bunch of different components. A few examples of what these look like. We have a box component. When I write my React code, I don't use divs, which is kind of weird. The benefit is I don't have to write any class names. I don't have to write any CSS. It's all built into this box component. When I say padding equals 1, I know that the padding on every side of my box is going to be 4 pixels. It makes it very, very consistent across your app. You're not going to have like 3 somewhere, 7 somewhere, 12 somewhere. You're going to have the exact same paddings everywhere, which makes it very nice. We've got an image component, which handles if you've used Pinterest and like while the image is loading, we have like the color block, that's the dominant color. We've got a text component that handles all of that. And for those rare situations where you need to break out of it, we went with the classic React naming, and we have a dangerously set inline style property. It makes it really, really easy for us to do code mods as well for when we make changes to our component library. Like maybe we start supporting borders or something and we didn't previously. Now we can just go look through everywhere that dangerously set inline style is used, and we can update or remove all of the borders. It makes it really nice. There's some other components as well. There's really like 25 or something. Here's a few more what they look like. The Masonry one is really important. It kind of ties into this enforcement idea. One, because you're enforcing not just the layout, but you're enforcing performance. So this Masonry component handles all of our virtualization. If you're not familiar with what that is, that means you've got some screen. We call it a window. And while you're scrolling, anything not in the window, we don't want to render. So even if you've got 100,000 items in your list, you're only rendering what is in the current window. And that's really, really great, especially when you're on mobile and you've got not quite as much power as desktop has. Yeah, so this is idea of enforced consistency. And that component library is reused across desktop and mobile web, and in some of our other apps across Pinterest. There are some things that we did specifically for mobile web to enforce consistency as well that I think have been really, really helpful. And so we added a couple other components specifically for us. One was our page container. So this really just handles the margins on the page itself, and also works together with any headers that you have to push the content down below if it's a fixed header. We added a full width component in case you want to break out of those margins. We have a create feed component that I'm going to talk about later. We have fixed footer and fixed headers, and those will communicate with page container so that it knows where its margins should be. We've also got something called tap area, which has been really important for our accessibility efforts. Anything that you can touch on our mobile web code base is wrapped in a tap area and has a press state, and we're going to talk about that one a little bit more as well. And lastly, we use flow type. If you're not familiar with flow type or TypeScript, they are ways to type your JavaScript. We've got about 90% code coverage, which has been really great since we were able to start from scratch. And it has caught a lot of bugs and makes it really, really easy when you decide to make a change somewhere so that you know that you're not breaking anything else. All right, so that tap area component, here's some examples of what it enables for us. So down on the left side, clicking through the nav bar, on each click you see a circle. That is a press state. So as long as your finger is down, there's a press state. You get that feedback knowing that you're actually doing something. The middle one, you see there's some compression. That's another optional press state that you can have. And on the right side, we've got some touch optimization for our pull to refresh, which is really cool because it feels just like a native app. The create feed, what that does is it is kind of like a higher order component if you're familiar with React. It's a component factory function that you give some information to it and it returns a React component to you. So you can see down on the bottom how you would use it. And what this does in particular is it ties a feed to an API endpoint. Ours are called resources, so this one's called related pin feed resource. If you go to a pin page or a close-up page, down below there's a feed of related pins. And this is literally how we do it on our mobile web code base. It's incredibly easy. The create feed, what it returns is not just that Masonry component from our component library, but it also handles what is going to be rendered in there. So it can handle based on the type of the object in the feed. If it's a pin, it's going to render a pin. If it's a board, it's going to render a board. And it'll handle all of the also margins as well. So again, we have that enforced style consistency even within our feeds, which is awesome. Okay, so at this point, we've enforced consistent design. It's starting to look good, but really it's just this pretty pony, and it's not fast yet. But we have started to revise our history. So we are now the Pinterest is the portal to the bestest of mobile web UX. Thank you for the sighs. So next I'm going to talk about particularly one thing that we did for performance. If you are more interested in the performance aspects of what we did, Adi Osmani worked with us to put together a performance case study and really did a really fantastic deep dive. It's a very long article that talks about all of the stuff that we did, from the front end all the way to the back end into the build with Webpack. And there's going to be a link to the article at the end of the deck. So feel free to check that out. I highly suggest it. But the biggest thing that we did for enforcing performance was enforcing a normalized Redux store. So Redux for us is not just some object. It is a client-side database. That's how we handle it. And I'm going to talk about what that means. So if you're not familiar with normalization, the way it works is we've got this pin object. It's got an ID, an image, a board, and an original pinner. So it's like a board and a user. The board has an ID, a name, and an owner, which is another user. So really, we've got a pin, we've got a board, and 2 users. All right, there's these 4 different entities that we have inside of this one object. And we can take those and we can split them out and pull them out into these separate entities, and we stick them in Redux just like that. So now in my pin, the board is no longer an object, it's just the ID of the board. So it flattens everything out and pulls it out, and there are some big benefits to that. So for example, this is really, you probably can't even see this, it's pretty small. This is an example of what our Redux store looks like in production. We're pretty proud of it actually, and it is enabled in production. If you download the Redux dev tools, you can go to pinterest.com, make sure you're emulating mobile, and you can totally check out all of our actions that go through and how everything works. I think it's helpful for people to see in production. But if you can see in here, we've got up at the top, there's a boards section, and there is a board ID with a board in there. There's also a pin in there, and there's also 3 users down there. 2 of those were for the pin, and 1 of those were for the current actual user, so that would be me. There's other things in there, like a feeds section as well. But the way that the normalization works is we send a request to the API. It gives me back like a feed of pins, and I'm going to take that feed of pins, and each one of those pins I'm going to break out into these different entities. So now I've got a whole bunch of pins, I've got a whole bunch of boards, I've got a whole bunch of users, and I'm going to stick them all in individually, and the feed is going to become just a list of ID and type for each thing. So instead of like the full pin object in the feed list, all it is an object that says the ID is this thing and the type is pin. So it's completely normalized. There's only one place that you can look for the object, and it's there forever. One of the biggest benefits of normalizing your data is for things like, I'm going to show a GIF in a second, and the way it works is you're in a feed. So I've got some pin information. When I click on that pin, I'm gonna route to a different route. That route has some API that it's gonna go fetch for the pin, but I've already got information about the pin because I had something in the feed. So what I can do is I can immediately go to that new route without any delay while the API is still fetching the rest of the data, and I can fill in the rest of the pin information that I have once it comes back. It makes it really, really fast, and it actually makes it so you can do really cool things like I can click on that when I'm offline, right? I've already got pin information. I'm not going to get the rest, but I can still see like the description, and I can get the image. And that's really cool. So I think I'm going to maybe skip over this one just for time's sake. Oh yeah, so this is back to the story. It was at this point that we started to see a light at the end of the tunnel. Our site was beautiful and fast. People are like laughing. I'm laughing myself. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I'm sticking with it though. I feel good about it. But still, it was just a website. It needed to be more. Introducing the progressive web app. I've got stickers. If you like Pinterest and progressive web apps, come grab a sticker from me afterwards. They look really good on your computer. So let's talk about that. Progressive web apps. There's a few things in particular that are important. First is service workers. How many of you are familiar with service workers? I usually feel like it's like 50-50. How many of you have written your own service worker? Most people don't write their own, right? You use like a build tool or something to generate it. So a service worker, for those who don't know, is essentially a sidecar process running next to your website. So you go to Pinterest.com, and that is one process, and there's a separate process that you can spin up that's running completely independently that can be there even when they are not on Pinterest.com, which allows for some really cool things. It also intercepts all of your outgoing network requests. So if you make a request for like some JavaScript bundle that you have on a CDN, it's going to go through your service worker, and then it's going to come back through your service worker. So you can have your service worker cache the information within itself, so that next time you don't even need to have internet connection, and you can go out and get these assets completely independent of whether you're online or offline, which is really cool. And I'm really excited about the possibilities that service workers are providing specifically for mobile web. So the way that you register a service worker is you check to see that it's supported, and then you just call it register. And that will be at pinterest.com/sw.js. You can go check it out if you want to. Like, that URL is valid. And you can look at what is in our service worker. Oh, I actually stole this particular slide from a talk I did last year. And I had to change it because previously I had the Safari icon and a crying face because Safari does not support service workers. But they have officially announced that they are supporting them in Safari Preview, which means that going forward, we will have, not just in Chrome, we will have in Safari and all of your mobile browsers, service workers. Give it up to Apple. If you're listening, Apple, thank you. All right, so a couple things that we did in particular for our progressive web app features. We use an app shell, and that is this small chunk of HTML that is cacheable. And that means that your service worker can cache the app shell also, not just like your JavaScript, your CSS. It can cache some HTML. And if you are offline, it can serve up that HTML and actually show content for your page. So that's what our app shell looks like. We also cache all of our JavaScript. We actually don't have any external CSS. We've got 6 kilobytes of inline CSS in our app shell, which means that if you are offline on Pinterest, you can actually see a feed of pins. If you are in Luna's experiment that caches unseen pins. We also have notifications enabled for mobile web, which is awesome. The UX for the notifications prompt has changed since this image. So beware if you start to add notifications, it's not going to look like that anymore. Notifications are also still not supported in Safari Preview, but in the future. And lastly, you can see an example here. I switched to offline. We say, hey, you're offline, but you can still click on pins and go check out stuff because we normalized the Redux store, which is awesome. There are other progressive web app features that I'm excited about in particular. The first is background sync. We've got an experiment out right now enabling background sync. If you're not familiar with what that is, that means that you can send out a network request, but you can specifically say that this is a background sync request. So this is something that if I am offline and I tried to make the request, the service worker can say, I'm going to hold on to this, and when you come back online, I'm going to make it, which is really, really important for mobile phones in particular. Like if I'm going on Caltrain down and I'm going through some tunnels, I lose connection, and Pinterest tried to make some like logging request saying that I did something, or maybe it's trying to make some request saying that I pinned something, and it fails. Now we can just say, assume it worked, and then when you come back online, it will work, which is really cool. The image capture API will allow some cool web features. Specifically, we've got a feature called Pinterest Lens. If you haven't used it before, it's really cool. You can take pictures of anything. Like you can take pictures of someone's shoes if you think they're cool, and it'll show you similar results. And it's really, really good. Web Share API. This is for opening up the native share sheet. So if you share something from a native app, you get the full share sheet showing like all of the different apps that you can share to. And we can enable that now in mobile web as well, which is cool. Credential management will allow you to specifically share credentials between subdomains, which is really powerful. And the device memory API, as we start to have people using mobile web more and use it like a native app, it will stay open for a long time, which means that you've got lots and lots of data coming in. And if you're normalizing your data, maybe we've got like tons of pins, tons of feeds, all this information. I want to make sure that I'm not going to like blow up their phone with how much stuff I've cached. So that will allow that. All right, so we've now revised the full history of Pinterest. You have the bestest mobile web version. It's existent. I want to download your super fast progressive web app. Pinterest, love it. All right, so the last part that you've all been waiting for is the results. One thing I wanted to mention that I think is really important is, this is a conversation that we had to have over and over again within the company, is that you have to be aware of legacy assumptions. It's very easy to, specifically for us, it was the native apps perform much better, but that is compared to the garbage version that we had previously, right? So you can't say that the native app is better than the mobile web app when you don't actually know. So you have to be aware of these like assumptions that you make based off maybe old, outdated information. So first off, the performance metrics are time to first paint, went from 4.2 seconds to 1.8 seconds. Our time to interactive, meaning that you can like click on things and move around, went from 23 seconds to 5.6 seconds. Thank you. The JavaScript bundle size went from 620 to 150. And the CSS bundle size went from 150 down to 6 kilobytes of inline CSS. And that was thanks to our component library. All right, so the performance metrics, I've got some unmarked graphs that you can look at. These are real graphs. You can kind of tell when we started to experiment and started to ramp these things up. It's pretty freaking cool. But then what you really care about is the actual numbers. So here, pin impressions, that's how many people have seen some number of pins, increased by 250% year over year. The number of ad impressions, so that's how we make money at Pinterest, increased by 400% year over year. Signups increased by 380% year over year. Logins increased by 150% year over year. There are more logins than signups, so it was actually a lot more like raw count for logins. The number of repins, or people who save a pin, increased by 200%. And time spent on mobile web increased by 160%. That is insane. If you need anything, if you're trying to get your company to invest more in mobile web, show them this slide. This is literally all you need. This is insane. And the craziest thing about this is that we didn't actually cannibalize that much from our native apps. That was the thing that we were worried about. But the fact is we just didn't do it. People were going to use the native apps if they wanted to use the native apps. But the people who wanted to use the mobile web now had a reason and way to do it. So here are the links. If you're interested, the PWA performance case study by Adi Osmani. There's a couple of talks from Chrome Dev Summit that they talked about our PWA in. And then lastly, our service worker open source library. Thank you very much. That's it. We've got a little over 5 minutes for questions. If anybody's got questions, yeah.
Do you have a fallback?
We do not.
Oh.
Nope. No fallback. That's a good question, though. Yeah, so that is, Adi Osmani suggests a Moto G4, and that is what we used for those. You mean I shouldn't use like my iPhone 10 to benchmark mobile web for our international users?
It would be slow.
Yeah, right? Yes?
What about the animation?
Animations, yeah. I mean, we've got some animations. You saw like the compression animation. There's not a whole lot of animations. The pull to refresh is a request animation frame animation based on like how far you've gone. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of animations in there right now, but potentially in the future. If you use the native apps, like we've got like really cool animations between routes. Specifically, if you like click on a pin, there's like this cool zoom thing that it does. So we've experimented with doing that, and we might enable it for like faster phones, but yeah. We do not. Nope. Yeah, so you can. In mobile web, I don't think we actually have anywhere that we've used it. Desktop uses it in some places. The way that we do it is there is margin, but you can also do SM margin, and that will be based on a media query. So it's small margin. There's medium margin and large margin. And so that is for some fixed interval of your media query. So, yeah. Yeah, so the question was, do we use any like JavaScript, like styled components kind of thing for our CSS and JS? We do not use a CSS and JS per se. We kind of do. So for the mobile web code base, there is no actual CSS that we write, but the component library uses CSS modules currently. But we're thinking about maybe switching that out. Yeah.
2 questions.
Yeah, so 2 questions. First is server rendering with React. Yes, our desktop still does server rendering. We had server rendering built in for mobile web at the start, but we took it out in favor of the app shell. But we might end up putting it back in for SEO reasons. But right now it's not enabled. But our desktop is still completely server rendered. And the second question was, on the back end, what do we have? There are some talks about this that maybe I can point you to, but the gist is it's Python and Node. Python is the legacy one. Node is where most of it happens now. So Python and Node talk to each other and then spit stuff back up. So Node is obviously where the React rendering happens. Yes, we are hiring. Okay, thank you very much.